As the year, and by extension the decade, keeps running its current course, it's unclear if the trends of today are just small fragments of the larger changes to come, or whether the stage is being set for a fundamental shift, one that might just push the Earth into something that would seem foreign to all living on it today. Although it may be impossible to properly comprehend, it's clear that significant seeds are being sown, and for better or worse, these effects will likely be felt for decades to come. Let's examine the fruit of today. The coronavirus has now been upgraded to a global emergency by the World Health Organization, with over 80,000 cases in 34 countries being confirmed as of writing. The response to the virus has been mixed, with the Chinese government both jailing those who criticize their actions in trying to contain the outbreak, while also accomplishing a logistical marvel by building an entire hospital in just 10 days. China currently makes up for over 97% of all cases of coronavirus, but one of the biggest pockets outside of the nation isn't in a country, but rather on a British cruise ship docked in the port of Yokohama, Japan. As many as 634 of the 3,711 passengers have been infected aboard the vessel, with at least 2 confirmed dead. The virus has proven to not be fatal in the vast majority of cases, with fatalities resulting from only 2% of all patients. Symptoms include pneumonia and shortness of breath, but the most severe of cases have led to respiratory failure, septic shock, and eventually organ failure. Coronavirus also appears to be most dangerous to the elderly, with cases in children considered rare. Men and people who have pre-existing conditions are also much more at risk. Interestingly, the virus, which has slowed, and in many cases shut down many Chinese industries, has led to a 25% reduction in CO2 emissions in the country, which equates to a 6% reduction worldwide. The guy who decided to munch on that first infected wild animal had no idea what kind of an impact his lunch was about to make, and how this snack was about to lead to 10% of the entire population of Earth being left under quarantine. A blogger by the name of Imran Aliyev was assassinated in a French hotel at the end of January after long-standing criticism of Russia's current standing president, Vladimir Putin. The 44-year-old man was found by a hotel manager with his throat cut, and a search has been called for his travel companion, who disappeared shortly after the killing took place. Mr. Aliyev had been under police protection in Belgium before the incident, and he had previously released a video claiming that an attempt on his life had been made in the middle of last year. A week after the murder was reported, French police announced that they believe the killer to be linked to Ramzan Kadyrov, the current ruler of Chechnya, and can be best described as the Raditz to Putin's Vegeta. European intelligence and law enforcement officials have voiced their concerns about the number of assassinations of anti-Putin critics by state-sponsored hit squads over the last few years, with at least 15 cases occurring in the UK alone. With Russia having the capability to assassinate people by grazing them with the end of an umbrella in the Cold War era, it's clear that such blatant killings are very much designed to send a message to all who oppose the Russian, or by extension, the Chechen government. Regardless, this is just the real-life equivalent of murdering the person who said they had a relationship with your mother on Xbox Live, only far more pathetic. Meanwhile, the Chinese government senses a trending movement that was against censorship. TikTok waits 3 hours before reporting the death of one of its users to the police, and another challenger has entered the Chinese disease arena. The Prime Minister of Finland has gone on record to say that Nordic nations of Northern Europe were better equipped to provide the famously sought-after American dream, in which anyone is able to become successful with enough hard work and dedication. The Prime Minister went on to credit its healthcare and social welfare systems, as well as free higher education, as driving forces behind this success, but warns against forcing this kind of system on countries that are not equipped to adopt them. It's of course difficult to determine whether her case for the American dream is a current reality, but coming from the 34-year-old leader of the happiest country on earth, who was the first in her family to attend university, she certainly seems to be the living embodiment of her argument. At the same time, the pole vaulting world record has been broken. The US military isn't allowed to fix its own equipment, and a rapper in Saudi Arabia is jailed for respecting women. In an epic pro-gamer move, the United States has reversed its decision of banning the use of landmines, which has been in effect since 2014. The explanation behind the decision was that the restriction on the use of landmines would place US forces at a severe disadvantage during combat, and that modern anti-personnel mines can be set to self-destruct after a certain period of time, as to not persist on a battlefield. Many legal and humanitarian experts have condemned the decision, stating that such weapons violate international law, as they cannot differentiate between civilians and armed combatants. Since 1999, over 122 casualties have been recorded from landmine use worldwide, with 87% of those killed or injured in 2017 being civilians. The relationship between the United States and landmines is nothing short of complicated, as despite not being part of the 164 nations to sign the Mine Ban Treaty, which came into effect in 1999, the US has spent more than the next 10 biggest contributors combined in anti-landmine efforts. It was difficult to find consistent statistics, but depending on the source, it is estimated that between 20 to 40% of all landmine victims are children. Meanwhile, the justification for assassinating that Iranian guy at the start of the year has been changed again. Humans are dabbing on the dumb shit environment, and the IRS redacts the requirements to report Fortnite V-Bucks. Mexican authorities have reported a shift in organized crime groups away from the traditionally profitable illegal narcotic trade and instead into avocados, spurred on by increased overall production and the demand of the US market. Criminal organizations have been taking advantage of a now $2 billion a year Mexican avocado industry. The fruit, which has now been compared to conflict minerals such as gold, tin, and tungsten, has become a more enticing target for Mexican organized crime, which has moved from the simple extortion of avocado farmers and onto outright stealing truckloads to sell for huge profit margins. A contributing factor of this unlikely new venture has been indirectly linked to the United States opioid crisis, which has seen legal painkillers such as fentanyl tank the profit margins of some illegal opium producers by up to 75%. The problem has reportedly become so bad that Mexican police in some cases have refused to intervene, and a handful of avocado producers have instead turned to private security to offer protection. WikiLeaks founder and Australian activist Julian Assange claims that he was bribed to cover up information for the US president. In a statement made by his lawyer, Assange detailed that a US congressman by the name of Dana Orabacher had offered to pardon him for leaking classified information on US military operations in return for saying that the Russian state had nothing to do with the 2016 US election. The Wall Street Journal had published a story detailing a deal of this kind as early as September 2017, but White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham called the claim absolutely and completely false. An important distinction to make is that there is currently no evidence to suggest that the president was at all involved in this deal, and that the congressman acted of his own accord. The revelations come during an extradition case for Mr. Assange, which would see the 48-year-old sent to the United States for espionage charges. Viewers may remember Julian Assange being evicted from the Ecuadorian embassy in London in April of last year after seeking asylum in the building since 2012, and has since been in the custody of UK police. WikiLeaks to this day has released a myriad of information pertaining to the United States, including the manual for the Guantanamo Bay prison camp, several instances of the US committing war crimes, and the infamous Hillary Clinton email leak in 2016. A report by the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service has claimed that the Russian state will continue to use cyber operations to influence governments outside of its borders. Surprised Pikachu face. The goals of the Russian government are said to focus on larger European Union states, like Germany, France and Italy, where it hopes to install as many seats as possible. for members likely to be sympathetic to Russian interests. The report warns that Russia also plans to interfere with the US presidential election taking place this year, and states that the secondary goal of the campaign is to convince citizens of said nations that their governments are incapable of holding fair elections. This is thought as an attempt to sway international opinion on their own elections, which any rational human being will tell you is an absolute fucking joke. This month also saw continued confirmation of the Russian state interfering with this year's US elections. Reports of the Republican current president, Donald Trump, and the Democratic frontrunner, Bernie Sanders, both receiving support from the Russian government, proves that Russian officials don't give a shit who wins the election. The goal at the end of the day is to undermine the eventual winner of the upcoming election and instill a sense of fundamental corruption among every American voter. If Russia's goal is to divide the American population, then very unfortunately, it seems to have been a resounding success. An almost 2-decade search by an Indian survey team has literally struck gold, with a deposit found that is estimated to equate to 3,500 tons of gold ore. The enormous find, which is 5 times larger than India's current reserve of gold, is estimated to be worth $225 billion, which would be enough to build the tallest building in the world 150 times, lift every person on the planet out of poverty for over a year, or to run the US military for nearly 3 months. The Indian government is currently dividing the land to be auctioned off to mining companies in the near future. Meanwhile, NASA gets a 12% boost for its budget going into 2021, and SpaceX is preparing for its very first manned spaceflight. 1 hour before the start of January, the United Kingdom officially left the European Union, which effectively starts a transition period which will expire at the end of this year. Viewers may have noticed that we've talked about Brexit very little on this series, which is partly because of its stretched out nature, and partly because admittedly, I didn't want to touch that shit with a 10-foot pole. The following was researched and written by Jack the Intern. Brexit tends to lead to a polarizing argument on British independence from the rest of Europe, and because of this, we'll try our best to give as much detail without picking a side. With this said, you cannot explain the difference in opinion on Brexit without talking about the different parties in Parliament. The Conservative Party currently holds the most seats, with a total of 365. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is a member of this party. Members of the Conservative Party argue that the United Kingdom has lost sovereignty over the past few decades as a result of their participation in the European Union, and they claim that the European Union has constrained Britain's economic prowess through trade and manufacturing regulation. The party holding the second most seats in Parliament is the Labour Party, with 202. This party is divided on Brexit, with some wishing to leave the European Union just on different terms, and others wanting to simply remain. Leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, has stated that he wishes to remain neutral on the subject and leave the decision to a referendum voted on by the people. The remainder of the parties are in opposition to Brexit, including the Scottish National Party, Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru, the Green Party, and the Independent Group for Change. These parties hold a collective 67 seats in Parliament. The decision to leave the European Union has been a debate going back several years, but let's try to break down why the UK would and wouldn't want to leave. Leaving the EU would not only free up an estimated £8.5 billion per year in membership fees, but it would also allow the country to avoid much of the bureaucratic red tape that inevitably comes with being part of the Union, and many of the rules that all members are required to follow. One of the biggest being centered on immigration, which would allow the UK to have ultimate control of its borders. The entire case for leaving the EU is to restore British sovereignty, which in theory would allow the nation to form a stronger identity and become free from the restrictions of the all-encompassing European Union. The argument for not leaving the European Union centers around the large amount of benefits it provides to its member countries. The European Union is what's called a political economic bloc, and its purpose is to combine the nations of all 27 member states to become more militarily, economically, and politically competitive with the rest of the world. Nations can trade freely across borders. Citizens of member countries can live and work in all other nations without restriction, and all consumer goods and human rights are protected by union law. The concept is that making business easier to conduct will lead to more trade, which will in turn lead to an increase in prosperity for all countries involved. The only question is whether the £8.5 billion per year saved from the membership fee and the increased new freedom of independence will outweigh the benefits that the European Union was able to provide. Many believe the United Kingdom's decision to leave the EU will lead to another referendum in Scotland for independence, with the majority of Scots being in favour of remaining in the Union. However, historically, Scotland just seems to like holding independence referendums every time the wind changes. Additionally, Brexit has led to strained relations with Ireland, with some predicting it may lead to a hard border between the two nations, but this is entirely speculation. With Parliament's decision to leave on January 31st, they have until the end of this year to agree on new trade and immigration regulation with the rest of the EU. Until the new terms are agreed upon, the same laws and regulation rules will still apply in the UK. In entertainment, Adam Sandler signs a $275 million deal to make 4 movies for Netflix. Birds of Prey and Cats perform terribly. We get our first look at Robert Pattinson's Batman, and a documentary is being made on the iconic Tony Hawk Pro Skater series. Trailers were also released for Wes Anderson's The French Dispatch, a Saw spin-off starring Chris Rock, and the 9th entry to the Fast and Furious franchise. Not to be confused with the Golden Globes from January, the Oscars were held this month. However, even a performance by Eminem couldn't save the event from having the lowest television viewership in history. Viewers who want to find the entire list of winners can refer to the sources in the comment section, but some of the highlights include Joaquin Phoenix winning Best Actor for Joker, Renee Zellweger for Best Actress for Judy, and Best Animated Feature going to Toy Story 4. The top award for Best Picture was awarded to Parasite, which marks the first time a non-English film has been given the title. The director also won the Sir Swag News Team's Flex of the Month award, as he made the Best Director and Best Film Oscars kiss each other. In technology, Twitter has considered expanding its campaign against misinformation that is specifically focused on political figures. A system that has been trialed within the company would reportedly flag a tweet as harmful or misleading and provide a large warning to viewers that this may be the case. Twitter wants this system to be run by community supporters, much like Wikipedia, with more credible contributors having more power to flag and investigate tweets when necessary. Supporters of the feature have praised the company for attempting to tackle one of the most damaging problems of the modern world. However, critics have remained unconvinced, as this kind of system may be open for abuse. Meanwhile, Scotland is very green. London is trying to replicate Watch Dogs Legion. Facebook is yet to pay $9 billion in taxes, and flip phones are coming back in force. In gaming, GeForce Now, Nvidia's game streaming platform, is officially out of beta. Sharing many similarities to the underwhelming Google Stadia, the service aims to let players use their own already owned games instead of paying for them within the platform. The service currently has a lot in its favor, with the price being the most enticing. Users can either use a less comprehensive free version or pay as little as $5 more for the premium experience. Theoretically, this is designed so people who don't wish to spend thousands on expensive PCs can instead pay $60 a year and still maintain the processing power needed to run high-end games. The downside, however, is that users will need exceptionally high-speed internet, have to live in the select areas of service, and be very strangely limited to 6 hours of use per day. GeForce Now also doesn't support all games available on the market, but the service could be very enticing to those who fit within its target market. Sony's upcoming PlayStation 5 is reportedly going to cost $450 per unit to manufacture, which is far more than the estimated $381 cost and the $400 selling price for the PlayStation 4 when it first hit shelves. Game consoles, especially in recent years, have often been sold at either extremely thin margins or even at a loss to the manufacturer, as the revenue is then made up in online subscription services and the lucrative licensing fees for game developers. With the new Xbox also set to launch this year, and with its price unlikely to be announced until E3 in June, the likelihood that Sony would announce such an impactful decision before Microsoft sets price expectations is nearly at zero. With this said, viewers should probably expect consoles this generation to be slightly more expensive than they were 8 years ago. Meanwhile, Sony finally buys Insomniac Studios, Blizzard offers automated refunds for its terrible Warcraft 3 remake, and Ubisoft is developing a AAA VR title. This has been the news for February. Last month I put out a survey which was designed to get a better picture of what you, as viewers, want to see from this series. My aim was to get around 1,000 respondents, but you collectively smashed that goal 10 times over. Here are the findings, for those who are interested. When asked what kind of work should be outsourced, both an editor and a writer were voted most important, with singer and voiceover receiving the least amount of support. The question on additional content was also insightful, with post-video streams being the least popular, dedicated news videos on specific topics receiving the most support, and news videos that cover the past and future sitting in the middle. When asked how long the news should be, the majority of respondents had no preference and instead wished it to be adaptable month to month, although the overwhelming majority wanted it to be at least 10 minutes long. Interviews also saw high support, and most viewers prefer to focus on both reporting and entertainment, as opposed to an emphasis on one over the other. Very interestingly, most respondents also perceived the series to be mostly unbiased. However, there seem to be more people who see the series as left-leaning, as opposed to those who perceive it to favor right-leaning viewpoints. In terms of the last 3 questions, which were open-ended, it would be impossible to accurately summarize the opinions of over 10,000 people, but we are going to attempt to do that anyway. The reason as to why people watch the series mostly centered on a burnout of traditional news sources, which wasn't at all surprising. The specific suggestions to make the series better was even more complicated, but this mostly boiled down to both more content and more polish. The last question was what would convince viewers to become Patreon supporters, and it's not an exaggeration to say that 90% of people said they simply couldn't afford to do so. I'd like to make it entirely clear that I don't want anyone who can't afford to become a donator to pledge any amount of money, but for those who wish to support the series, a link to my Patreon will be in the description. I'd like to thank every viewer and donator who make this all possible.